92 million tonnes of clothing. That's how much clothing goes to landfill globally annually every year. And this was a key starting point for me as a research question and a global challenge. And to examine this question and to really try to understand what's going on, my research looked at what consumers are doing in the home and also the challenges that the industry face in the processing of clothing. And I'm delighted today that Laura and Alan are here to join me. And I want to start by asking Laura just to tell me about some of the challenges that you talked about, Laura, so you so generously invited me into your home and I came along virtually because it was during the pandemic. But you told me so much about some of the challenges that you face as a consumer at the clothing end of life stage. And I wondered if you could share some of those insights with me now.
Yeah,
Thank you.
So I think this is also a perfect time to talk because it's kind of the start of a new season in terms of fashion, I suppose, autumn, winter. So every season I would work through my wardrobe, work out what's working and what's not, work through my own personally, work through my daughter's and that of clients too. So once I've gone through this, make decisions on what we're going to keep, and then it comes to the other end of it, the bits that we're going to clear. So within that, I feel I have like three sections, I suppose, of that. I've got the split into the good bits that you'd maybe sell via like Vinted or eBay or something like that, and then the not to sell, which I've been putting to like charity or charity bags, and then the bits that maybe go in the charity bins, which is more sort of like PJs, end of life jersey kind of things, and then maybe the throwaway pieces, which are probably then put in like blue recycle bins that we have in Edinburgh, like pants, holy things, discoloured things and bobbled things is basically what I do. But I suppose I'm saying this tentatively. I'm unsure if I'm doing the right thing and where these pieces should be really going to maximise their potential of reuse.
Thanks so much for starting us off there. And I think a lot of what you were saying was what came through in many of the households. These were a lot of the themes that were coming through in my research in terms of splitting it out into your three categories of selling, giving away, and then putting in, as you said, the blue bag, the recycling. But what I found was that everybody was really confused. There was a lot of confusion about whether, like you say, are we doing the right thing? And questions around, and I remember you talking about this, Laura, about where do you get your information from? Mm-hmm. And is this still the same challenge for you in terms of finding the right information or finding any information about what you should be doing at the disposal stage?
So it's funny actually, because I did research a little bit further after our discussion, and again it feels really vague, as in where and what I should put in. It's kind of clothing can be recycled, but then it doesn't break it down into like fabrications or things like that. So it just felt there was more information needed, basically, as a consumer as to what to do for the best. But I feel that a lot of consumers would probably think they are doing the best by putting certain things into charity shop because it's almost become, I don't know, socially, that's what you do. So, yeah, I feel there's a lot of like peers and they turn to those to see as to what they would do with that kind of stuff.
Thank you. So really lucky that we have Alan with us today, who's going to help us unpack some of these challenges. And Alan, of course, you were a really generous participant in my research representing the textile recycling industry. And you really shared a lot with me at the time. And I wonder if you could help us unpack this consumer challenge.
Try my best.
If you just start first of all by just telling us a bit about the textile recycling industry. It's perhaps when we're in this space really obvious, but I think what I learned is consumers are really challenged to understand what the textile recycling industry is and how it actually works.
I mean, I think apart from anything else, a big issue is that that a lot of what we do is centered around reuse rather than recycling. So, Laura, I think what you described there about how you separate things out is absolutely brilliant, because you're obviously clearly thinking about this a lot more than many people do. But essentially, what happens to clothing and textiles when you put it in a charity shop, for example, which is the biggest source of collection in the UK. About 50% of all clothing that ends up being donated for reuse or recycling goes through charity shops. About 50% of what is actually sold, donated to the shop, is actually sold in the shop itself. So, the charities will do some sort of sorting, behind the store. They will, if they feel they can't sell it because of it's, too worn or too tatty, then they will put it out for sale to a merchant. But also we get good quality clothing coming through, because it could be out of season, or it could be that, they've got 100 garments of 100 shirts and they can only sell so many shirts. So what you get coming out the back end is a real mix of good quality clothing right through to the recycling grades. Similarly, if the other big collection method that you also refer to are textile banks, they account for about 30% of all clothing that is collected, clothing and textiles collected. So those two account for 80% roughly overall. Then what happens to that clothing and that textile? It goes back to a depot. Now that can be either here in the UK, or it could possibly be in Eastern Europe, somewhere like that. And what they will do then is sort the clothing and textiles into typically around 200 grades, of which about probably 190 of them will be reuse grades. So what they're doing is they're preparing them for resale on the global markets, because the main global markets for used clothing are Eastern Europe. It was, countries that are now in the EU, but now it tends to be sort of more the former Soviet countries where there's the main market there. You've got Sub-Saharan Africa, which is another very important market. And then you've got markets in Pakistan for recycling and also for reuse, and also India's an important recycling market. So those are the kind of, outlets that they go into. What happens to recycling? Well, the issue with recycling is it doesn't have any value. And so therefore, it makes it very difficult for somebody to make money from it if what they are collecting is just 100% recycling grades. So when you go to a textile bank, it will almost invariably say, we only want good quality reusable clothing. And in doing so, they will probably get about 60% that is good quality reusable clothing. The other 40% currently has to go for recycling. And that is a ratio that they can just about cope with. So yes, we can mechanically recycle, textile products, but if we have too much, it creates a problem.
Alan, I think what was really interesting there, you mentioned the 200 grades, and my understanding is that in the textile recycling system, perhaps generally at the front end in the charity retail, it's still very much a manual process. So it's still people who are sorting, and it starts with the consumer. And all of this I found is very subjective, because it's done by the eye and it's done by our personal preferences, really, whether we're the consumer or the volunteer in the charity shop. And so how does that work? Could you tell us a bit more about that actual sorting process with those grades?
Well, I can tell you about what happens when it goes back to a depot, but you're absolutely right. I might say my shirt is perfectly reusable, and my wife will go, no, it's not. So, and that then manifests itself in other ways. So, and yes, we've tried trials where we've asked the public to separate out what they deem to be good quality clothing from the recycling. And of course, there is that problematic issue of, is that good quality, or is it rubbish, or not, or recycling, should I say? So you're right, though. When it goes back to a depot, currently, almost all the sorting is done by hand. So it takes about 6 months to train up a sorter. So that in itself is, an expensive process, because you have to pay them a good wage to be able to do that. And yes, they don't actually rely on the label, because what we've found is often the labels are wrong, actually. And we could talk about the new sorting technologies that are coming on, and it's using near infrared technology to identify fiber types. We found that the labels on particularly on blends are incorrect. So it's much better to rely on people's expertise. And I can't do it, but they'll just go, that's polycotton, that's cotton, that's polyester, that's nylon, or whatever, and it's amazing, and they can sort a garment out within a few seconds. But of course, that's still viable for the higher value reusable clothing. So you're paying somebody £11-12 an hour. Sorry, scrap that, £10 an hour. I think we better say you're paying somebody £10 an hour to sort the clothing. That costs money. If you are then literally having to send it for recycling, where they're not making any money, there is a problem there. So one of the interesting areas that is being developed in a couple of places, I think there's two that are really sort of, ahead of the game compared to others, are the use of near-infrared sorting technology to quickly sort out clothing that can only go for recycling. So instead of actually paying somebody, to do it, and having dozens of people on the sorting line, you can literally put the worn out clothing in the front end through an NIR technology, and then it will whiz along the belt, and then when it gets to the appropriate section, a jet of air will blast it off the belt and into the nylon pile or the polyester pile or something like that.
Wow.
But that's still in development. So you got. I'll let you ask your question. Go on. Yeah, sure.
It's really fascinating with the technology, but I'm sort of just going back and still thinking about the confusion of what do we actually mean by reuse and recycle?
Yeah.
Could you unpack for us a bit more about what we mean by recycle?
Well, reuse is obviously, it's good quality and it can be used again in its original form. Recycling, at the moment, you can recycle clothing and you can recycle textiles, but it isn't recycled in the main back into a similar garment. It's very difficult to recycle clothing back into clothing. So at the moment, you might get a cotton T-shirt, and the easiest form of recycling a cotton T-shirt is to cut it up and you've got an industrial wiping cloth. That's a very, sort of basic form of recycling. And I suppose another issue is that actually you can only really use it once, because once it's covered in oil or paint or whatever, it's going to be exceptionally hard to recycle that again. Other forms of recycling that are, mainstream are you pull the materials and you can use it, the resulting fibres in bedding material, manufacture bedding material, insulation, that kind of thing. And actually, it's often referred to as downcycling, and I'm a bit of a campaigner here, and I kind of say, well, actually, if they go into that form of recycling, particularly if it goes into insulation, you're making a product that is designed to cut energy usage, and B, that once that insulation goes into a building, it's likely that it will last there for the entire lifespan of that building. So I would say on a life cycle analysis, if we were to do that, actually it would score really well. So I think that often gets overlooked, because the fashion industry want their fibres to be recycled back into clothing so that they can keep hold of it. So, and I would say, how often would you have to recycle your clothing to get the same benefit as if you recycle it back into insulation? So,
yeah, really interesting point. On the topic of recycling, what I found really interesting was we're talking about clothing and clothing reuse and recycling. But what I found as a consumer, I don't know about you, Laura, that the recycling bins for clothing are generally in car parks, which are generally quite polluted and dirty spaces. I did follow some of my consumers to to high street retailers where there's take-back schemes. I wondered, Laura, what your experience was of the textile recycling bin and what you felt about that.
Yes. Completely agree. They always look a bit dirty around them, don't they? So then to want to put your clothing in them. But yeah, I've typically used clothing recycle bins, and I have put then clothing in bags into the shops to then get the give back, and that's really good as well, because then feel you're doing something and get something back. So it's quite nice.
And I know that we've had conversations in the past, Alan, about some of the pollution challenges, the contamination challenges of the bins themselves, with people being a bit confused about how to use them, but also abusing them. Could you talk a little bit about the industry experience of that?
Well, I would say that the quality that you get from different types of collection varies. So, again, Laura, you mentioned that you put your stuff out sometimes for charity bag collections. Charity bag collections tend to be good quality because people are very careful, very selective about what they want to put out there, because they obviously they see it's for a particular charity and they want to raise money for that charity. So therefore, the quality you get from that is actually usually pretty good. I have to say participation rates are a problem though. So it's very difficult to make money from charity bag collections. So there are issues there. With textile banks, obviously they are permanently in situ, or more or less permanently in situ. People know where they are, and so therefore it can be quite it's more straightforward in terms of working out how often you need to service the banks, but you do have the quality issue there. I don't think there's much in the way of pollution per se getting inside, but people do sometimes use them as general refuse bins as well. So that is an issue. So you do get things in there, and I would ask people not to put anything other than textile products in there, please, because yes, you don't want your pizza boxes or anything like that in there. Yeah.
And I think the other thing is that I don't know if you've had this experience yourself, Laura, that when you go to the recycling bin, sometimes it's overloaded, and so people have put their bags outside the bin. And what happens to those bags? My understanding is that if the bag is outside and it's exposed to the elements, the recycling industry can't use it.
Yeah, and actually often it's not actually that the bank is full. It's sometimes that people have put too big a bags in the chute, so the chutes get blocked. So probably I would say that's about 50% of the time that happens. So again, that's one thing I'd say. Please make sure that you don't overfill the chute and allow it to go down. But yes, if it is caught out in the rain, there's really nothing you can do about it. So I know from my experience when I was a recycling officer in a previous life that anything left outside any recycling bank got picked up with the normal refuse and didn't get recycled, because it's the same with other material products as well. It's just the weather contaminates it. So, but particularly for clothing.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot about the challenges, and I know that one of the things that I was really struck with in my research was that in the 30 households that I worked with, everybody was looking for solutions and trying to keep clothing and textile in use. And can I just start by asking you, Laura, some of the ways that you keep things in use? How are you trying to contribute to reducing this 92 million tonnes of landfill?
Yes, so I'm a big advocate for shopping your wardrobe and utilising the clothing that you do already have. So that's what I do with my clients, and try and create more outfits from the clothing they own, then deciding on the key items that they need to make more use of what they have. Reusing items. One of the pieces I spoke with Lynn about was my daughter had outgrown, or she got a hole, I think, in some leggings that she had, and probably they were getting a bit short on her. So then I chopped off at the knee and made them into cycling shorts, so she used them into the summer months. And then also I it was at the time made her a little mask out of the bottom of kind of the thing. So that was I felt that I was doing quite well with that. But yes, so sorry. So solutions to disposal. I suppose one of the main things is I feel that there needs to be a bit more knowledge in and around how to maintain clothing, how to really look after it, even from hanging it up, storing it from a consumer point of view in your own wardrobe and looking after it. On my social media, I did a poll to see how many people iron. And that's a basic one. But there was 15% that do iron and the rest didn't iron. So that's a general maintenance really on clothes, isn't it? And I feel that if we knew how to look after our clothing better, that would have an impact on waste, I suppose, at the end, because it'd have a longer life, it would last longer in your wardrobe and things like that.
I think that's a really interesting point, and where confusion comes in.
Yeah.
Because from a sustainability perspective, people might, other areas of environmental sustainability would say iron your clothing less, use less energy. Whereas it's that really confusing messaging that we really need to understand. When is it valuable to iron something? Do we need to iron everything? Can we just iron some things? And what is that full maintenance cycle? So that's so interesting. I have to say I'm a bit of an ironer. I like to iron most things. But I have been taken to task recently with other colleagues saying, actually, we should be ironing less. We should be relying on fibre more to give us that presentation. But yeah.
I'm glad that only 15% iron, because I'm one of the non-ironers.
So from the other end of it. But even just the clothing maintenance side, I think, is something, because if we can, I mean, a lot of people would throw out if a jumper gets bobbly, that then a lot of wool natural fibres do bobble, so it's kind of learn how to maintain that, and almost the knowledge of the consumer that it's natural and how we can look after that kind of thing. But a lot of people would just be like, right, throw it out, it's too bobbly, I'm not going to wear it. So kind of those kind of key skills, I suppose, initially could really help. Just another one that I did actually yesterday, and it was talking about trainers and kind of how do you clean your trainers or not? And again, 60% didn't clean their trainers and they just left them kind of dirty. So it's and then they'll be like, oh, I'm over those, and then I'll buy a new pair. And it's, there's, I feel there's a big, there's a big thing on maintenance.
And cleaning trainers actually works a treat, actually. Just sticking them in the washing machine. So But funnily enough, with wool, actually, although it's only about 2% of the fibre mix in the country, it's actually one of the easiest fibres to recycle. So you could do it, not at a profit for us, but you can do it. So
could you tell us a bit more about that?
Not too much, no, because I'm not the scientist. But you got John Inuio in Yorkshire. He can tell you a lot more about that. So no, I can't. No, but you can blend virgin wool with recycled wool, and actually you come up with a quality yarn that is as good as the original. And in fact, in Prato in Italy, that's the wool recycling capital of the world. I've been told by someone I know there that actually what they do is that they will just simply make new wool yarns, and they don't tell their customers which ones have recycled content and which ones don't. And he says the ones with recycled content often sell better because there's more demand for it, because people like the quality of it. Yeah. So I think that says something. But it's like, well, why don't you tell people then it's made of recycled content? And I think that says something about the psyche perhaps still that exists, that if it's made from recycled fibres, be it paper or be it textiles, that it won't be as good quality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did find, Laura, like yourself, what I found with the pilling, again, I was amazed at how, contrary to this idea that consumers are very wasteful and throwing garments away, I found that participants were really trying to find solutions to things like pilling. They were using de-pilling tools, debobbling tools, and trying to keep something maintained until that personal tipping point where they thought, oh no, this is just too embarrassed. This is the jumper that I wore to work, and now I just feel it's just pilled too much and I just can't maintain it anymore, so I'm just going to wear it in the house. Did you see yourself as a consumer? Do you see that you perhaps extend the life of a garment in sort of outerwear and then
debobble
it and eventually decommission it, I suppose? Or could you tell me a bit about those processes in your house?
I think, yes, definitely. So I do use like defuzzing machine kind of thing on knitwear and things, but it does come to a point where it's too much or it gets a bit threadbare because you've kind of defuzzed it a bit too much kind of thing. And then it feels like it's out of use. So yes, it's definitely something that happens in our house.
Thank you. Alan, so we've got consumers trying to do the best they can. What is the industry doing to help us?
Well, one of the key issues is I've talked about the fact that we have mechanical recycling markets, but actually they are, although they're mature and they've been around for a long time, the markets are low in demand and they're low in value. And the problem that we have is that the more clothing, the more textiles we collect, the more recycling grades inevitably we will collect. And currently it is very difficult to find new markets for the recycling grades. So what I haven't talked about yet is the work that's now going on to develop chemical recycling processes. So when you pull a textile item, the fibre length shortens. So that's primarily why it makes it difficult to recycle clothing back into clothing. So yes, you can take denim waste and blend it with new cotton, and you can go to the shops probably down the road here and find denim jeans that contain 20% recycled content, but they can't go any higher than that at the moment, because if you have too much recycled content, it affects the performance. So that's a problem with mechanical recycling. With chemical recycling, you can actually, particularly with polyester, you can separate out the colours and the dyes and the finishes and so on and so forth, and you can actually produce a polyester pellet that can then be re-extruded and made into a new polyester yarn with very similar qualities to if it had been made as new. And similarly with cotton, you can't recycle it back into cotton, but you can recycle it back into a cellulosic fibre, and again of similar performance to that of virgin cotton, and if those processes can be made at a commercial scale, then that could be a real game changer, and we would then be able to potentially put out the message to the consumer, the very simple message: we will take any textiles. But we can't do that at the moment. We need to have that reuse element to pay for the recycling that we're making no money on. So yeah,
I think we all need that reuse. Consumers, we need that reuse of garments. And but one thing I remember you telling me about during my research was about the challenge of reuse, particularly in the charity retail system. And Laura, I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about how you select something, say if you're going to send it to the charity shop, or if you're going to put it in a charity bag.
Okay, so if I've got like a pile of things, I'd probably pick the bits that I feel that I could make some money on, probably put those on Vinted and eBay, which I presume majority of people probably would if they had time. Time's a massive element in that part. So dependent on who it was that maybe I'm clearing their wardrobes out, if they haven't got time to do that, they'll happily send it to the charity shop. That stuff that maybe still has tags on, or something that has a bit more use in it, definitely. And then it would be kind of things that I don't think I'd make much on, maybe more high street brands that I would then put to the charity shop that are still in good condition, but just I'm not using them, or that kind of thing. Yeah, so that's where I'd probably put it.
And I think what's really interesting about that, and this is really what strikes me, is, Alan, the technical information that you have about the recycling streams and the reprocessing of fibre. And Laura, as a consumer, you don't necessarily have those expertise. You are a fashion expert, you're a stylist, and you have a really fantastic business, but you're not necessarily a fibre expert. So there's a bit of a challenge there in terms of how we're evaluating a garment when we're sending it to the charity shop. So Alan, what I found was really interesting is what you were saying about only 50% of what we donate to a charity shop actually gets resold in that charity shop, and then the rest goes to the recycling industry. And what I think is really interesting about that is that we really want to move to a more local system of clothing circulation. And so if only 50% is being resold in the charity shop, that is quite a challenge for communities, because we're continuously going to have these new garments that we have to buy and bring into our homes, and then we're going to dispose of them again. And I believe it's something like 60% of clothing disposal goes to charity shops. So could you tell a bit about that?
It's around, I think, figures I've heard, about 330,000 tonnes a year goes into charity shops, and of which about 165 is sold in the shop itself. So I mean, it's a simple case of, obviously, charities themselves, they've got to, turn their stock over like every other retailer has, because otherwise, if they just had the same stock, unsold stock, they wouldn't get any custom coming in. So they need to be quite selective on what they put out, in the shop front. And of course, even though, I think most people try to be quite selective, it's inevitable that you're going to get stuff that is not really suitable at all to be sold. And so it's immediately goes for recycling. It's like, that's too worn out, we're not going to be able to sell that. But as I alluded to earlier, charity shops are generally small in this country. And so therefore they've got a limited amount of space out the back where they can actually store things. And so therefore they will, if they get too many garments in, or they have out of season garments, and they are really, a small, particularly if they're sort of an independent charity with only a few shops, they have no opportunity to circulate their materials. Some of the bigger charities, have their own warehousing, and so therefore they're more effective at saying, well, we can't sell it here, but we might be able to sell it in that store, or we can, look at these lovely coats, even though it's 40 degrees outside, you're not going to be able to sell those lovely coats. You wouldn't have been able to sell any coats this summer. But if you can take them back to a warehouse, maybe they're going to be starting to sell them now. But that's the issue that most charities have. They don't have the capacity to keep the goods. So that's, really why, you have so much of what is donated being then sold on to traders. But I do also remind myself, is actually, why is it that the public actually donate clothing or any goods to a charity shop? Ultimately, it's actually to raise money for the charity. So if they're selling it on to the customer, that's one thing. But if they're not selling it on to the customer, they might as well sell it on to a trader. So they're still making the money from it, albeit at a lower rate. But there is this thing about, yes, we want to keep it more local. We do have an issue, actually, with that here, because, despite... I was talking about how much waste there is in the UK or whatever. We have the highest collection rate of clothing in the world, alongside Germany. So we vie for, both countries sort of vie for first place each year. So we actually collect an awful lot of clothing in this country, largely because we do have such a fantastic network of charity shops. But that then in itself then creates a problem. It's like, well, how can we increase reuse even more when actually we're doing a lot of reuse already? I mean, I haven't even mentioned Vinted or Depop, but that's another thing that is, taking off. It's really kind of, this sort of entrepreneurial sort of element where people are now thinking, actually, I can sell my shirt for £10 now, which didn't happen 10 years ago. So we're already reusing an awful lot.
I think the challenge we have with the reuse, though, Ellen, when you put it like that, is we are also the biggest shoppers, fashion shoppers.
I was going to come on to that. Yeah,
and this is the challenge. And what we see in from our research is that people buy more because they know they can donate it.
Yeah,
and so it's this cycle of buying new because you can offload it to the charity shop. You can relieve your conscience as a shopper, and you can feel you're doing good.
Yeah,
and. So that is one of the key challenges. But I think you raised a really interesting point earlier that perhaps we don't think about, is that the charity retail model is based on the traditional retail model, and it is competing, or it is trying to manage itself in the high street. And I think that that's something that is overlooked in terms of this idea of how the textile recycling industry is there to support this model, which is challenged by trying to keep up with the seasons, aligned to the donations that they receive. So I think whilst people might be listening to this podcast and going, yeah, but where are the solutions? Where is this conversation going? And I think the challenge is that it just is bringing up the systems that we're currently working within, and the challenges that we have within them in terms of subjectivity of the market and the model.
Yeah.
But again, going back to how to solve those challenges, Depop, Vinted, again, a lot of participants being what I call kitchen or bedroom entrepreneurs, being able to really look at their wardrobe as a resource. Laura, do you want to talk a bit more about your Vinted or resale process that you go through, and as a consumer, but also in your professional capacity, do you have any tips or any explanation of your process that you can share?
Yeah, when it comes to selling, actually, I'm quite new to Vinted. It's a new one because I feel that I used eBay quite a lot for a number of years, and then I've recently moved to Vinted, but it's just a much simpler process. And I refer to time, but that is what affects people from doing these kind of things, because eBay is quite a process to get it on there. It takes your time. So when have you got time for that? It's almost like that bag in the corner that you need to keep coming back to add the odd bit here and there.
And of course, when you're talking about time, I mean, you're a mum, you're busy managing the household, the tasks and budget. So yes, in terms of time, how do you do that?
Yeah, I try to find some time to put some bits and pieces on, and I feel that this season, I suppose, I've been a little bit more conscious in it as well, to almost what I've been making from these things, I can then kind of like buy back off Vinted or eBay for like new season product. So I'm starting to think a little bit more longer term in that way as well. Another thing, just to talk into more like the buying prospect, is buying kind of like designer brands that maybe could resell, so then you can get value from it, or you could put it on these selling sites again, kind of thing, rather than just buying a high street brand that might not sell, might end up more in landfill kind of thing. So yeah, I feel that definitely ideas are changing on the consumer level, but there's still not enough information. In so many, I think there feels like there's a bit of a gap. There feels like there's an educational kind of level, then there's the consumer, if you like, and I feel that the two don't really marry up. Like, I feel there needs to be a bit more simplified avenues to what you actually need to do.
Alan, do you find that the Textile Recycling Association and, say, local authorities and other areas where there are platforms that consumers should be accessing information, are you seeing that that's easy for the industry to do? Where do you see the opportunities to work with consumers and educate?
I think at the moment we are in a bit of an in-between situation, because clearly the environmental and social awareness and the impacts of clothing, have become more obvious, and it's more like, well, what can we do about it? The reality of it is as it is at the moment, our practices are still where they were decades ago. That's the problem. And until we have that new investment and that new technology to actually recycle more clothing, we reuse, we will always find reuse markets. If there's demand for reusable clothing, the trade will sell on to those wholesalers that do it. But the issue is we can't collect more recycling grades at the moment, and that is the Achilles heel. And so I know I'm not sure if I'm really quite answering your question here, but this is the problem. We can't go out at the moment and just take any old rag. We do need that reusable.
How can you point the consumer at the moment? What I see and what I found in the research is very limited information. Consumers were just crying out for information about, should I put my clothes in a bag before I put it in the recycling bin? It was that simple. And I was really surprised that, and even when I looked on the local authority website of the area where the research was, there was very limited information for the consumer. I went to the recycling bins. Yeah. It was very confusing, particularly a charity retail bin, because it's very clear that they want the consumer to know that they're doing good. Yeah. But the information was so limited on how you should actually be engaging with this bin. So I just wondered how the Textile Recycling Association are tackling this, or if you see it as your responsibility, or if there is another body that you're working with.
Well, the banks that are run by legitimate organizations should make it very clear this is what we want and this is what we don't want, and I do see that on a lot of banks, but maybe people just overlook that kind of thing. But actually, on the question of plastic bags, I suppose when we didn't have to pay 10p or 20p or whatever we pay nowadays for plastic bags, and everyone got it for free, there was such a plethora of plastic bags that it was actually quite easy to say, can you please put it in a plastic bag, because it does actually keep the clothing drier and whatever, and that is the preferred position. But of course now I hardly have any plastic bags in my house, because I'm always carrying stuff out of the shop in my arms like this now, which is what we should have been. So that is more problematic. But yes, actually, if it doesn't say so, the consumer should be putting their clothing in the bags beforehand, because it does help.
And Laura, what sort of information would you like to see? What do you think would be helpful?
It could almost be like pictures, I suppose. But I suppose it goes back to the conversation that you said before, like what's good for you might be completely different. Yeah. What's good for me, what is waste for you is different to me, kind of thing. So it's that kind of like levels. But I suppose we're talking about the pilling, talking about holes, these kind of things, like where do we put those bits to enable you to get it to the right place, I suppose. That kind of thing could be, I don't know, there's a stain, put it in this bag, there's a bit, put it in there. Like that kind of level of information, and as simplistic as possible, would be amazing.
I mean, I suppose really, from what you were saying, and this is where we need to get to. We need to just get to a stage where we can say, we take your all-use textiles, but we are not there yet. Yeah. And that is the problem. I think, if you'd said it's got a little stain here, I think that would cause more confusion, actually.
Yeah, so one thing that we haven't discussed yet is hoarding. And we know that up to 40% of the average wardrobe is never worn. Laura, in your personal experience as a consumer, but also in your professional experience of helping other consumers manage their wardrobe, could you tell me a bit about hoarding and how that works, how you manage it?
Yeah, definitely. I do see this a lot. A lot of it can come into kind of emotive feelings in and around hoarding and keeping pieces. A lot of it could come in terms of they spent a lot of money on the item, and then they want to almost for it to pay them back in some way, be that one day they will wear it. And then a lot of people hold on to lots of clothes for a long time, and they don't get used, and they are just sat in their wardrobe redundant. And almost if there's a lot more clothing in someone's wardrobe, it's harder to see what they actually do have. And then I find that those people actually then do go on to buy more things. So it kind of like doesn't help the cycle almost.
And do you have any, in terms of your household management systems, do you have any advice for consumers or anything that you've found helpful?
To help, I regularly would always say, I mean, the start of the season is a great time to do it. So this like March kind of March kind of time for spring, summer, and September, October kind of time for autumn, winter, to just revisit what you have in your wardrobe, go through everything and work out what still works for you, what doesn't. It would actually save you money as well, because then you won't spend more money on things that you don't need in terms of clothing. But then this is a point where you can then clear or reuse or share with friends or something like that as well. So I would say 2 times a year minimal to go back in and see. But even before you go out to buy something new, look back and see what you have in your wardrobe, because a lot of the time people buy in ruts and they buy things that are very, very similar to what they already have. And I see that nearly majority of my clients always do that. But it's kind of, if you can visually see what you have, that's really important.
Yeah, and that sounds like fantastic advice. And we're coming to the end of the podcast now. So, Alan, the key finding was that consumers are calling out for information about what they should do to do the right thing. Could you just help us finish with some advice for how consumers should recycle to ensure that their clothing is reused or recycled in the best way?
Well, I think I've got to try and keep it simple, bearing in mind the limitations that we have. But actually, if you would if you yourself think that you would use the clothing item again, then please take it to a charity shop or put it in a charity bag or put it into a textile bank. And if you're not sure, but you think it probably is reusable, please again put it in the textile bank. Because if it's not, it will get recycled. That's the point. Yes, and also I would ask people to write to their MPs to say, please, can you support legislative drivers to help promote investment into new recycling technology. So write to your MP and say, come on, the textile recycling industry needs supporting. So because that's where we're heading. I think we could be seeing a different sort of environment, but it will be about 5 to 10 years before that actually happens.
Thank you, and thanks for that. I mean, I can only imagine that if the textile recycling industry is helped, the ultimate benefit is to the consumer, which is where in the household, which is where we really want to get.
Yeah, we want to be able to take every single textile item, and that can be done if we have the investment in the technology that is currently being developed, but has not come to commercial scale at the moment.
Thank you. You've both been fantastic and very generous, both in supporting with the original research back in 2020 and with your insights today. And so thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure having you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening and watching Cleaning the Loop, Driving Consumer Clothing Circularity, a podcast series produced by the Adam Smith Business School, University of Glasgow. If you would like to know more about my research or that of the scholars participating in the podcast series, please email me at lynn.wilson@glasgow.ac.uk. Thank you for listening and watching.